Chapter 15. Elizabeth Happens. Part 1. "I smell spring," Pat cried rapturously, sniffing the air one day, the day she discovered the first tiny feathery green sprays of caraway along the borders of the Whispering Lane. That same night the frogs had begun to sing in the fields of the pool. She and Jingle heard them when they were coming home in the dim from happiness. "I love frogs," said Pat. Jingle wasn't sure he liked frogs. Their music was so sad and silver and far away, it always made him think of his mother. Never, Pat reflected, looking back over her long life of almost 9 years, had there been such a lovely spring. Never had the long, rolling fields around Silverbush been so green. Never had the gay trills of song in the maple made by the well been so sweet. Never had there been such wonderful evenings, full of the scent of lilacs. And never had there been anything so beautiful as the young wild cherry tree in happiness, or the little wild plum that hung over the fence in the secret field. She and Sid went back to pay a call on their field one Sunday afternoon, to see how it had got through the winter. It was always spring there, before it was spring anywhere else. Their spruces tossed them an airy welcome, and the wild plum was another lovely secret to be shared. Everything was so clean in spring, Pat thought. No weeds, no long grass, no fallen leaves. And all over the house the wholesome smell of newly cleaned rooms. For Judy and Mother had been papering and scrubbing and washing and ironing and polishing for weeks. Pat and Winnie helped them in the evenings after school. It was lovely to make Silverbush as beautiful as it could be made. "Sure, and I do be gettin' spring fever in me bones," said Judy one night. The next day she was down with flu. It ran through the whole family, lightly, with one exception. Pat had it hard. "As she do be having everything, the poor darlint," thought Judy, and did not pick up rapidly. Aunt Helen came down unexpectedly one day and decreed that Pat needed a change. In the twinkling of an eye it was decided that Pat was to go to Elmwood for 3 weeks. Pat didn't want to go. She had never been far away from Silverbush overnight, and 3 weeks of nights seemed an eternity, but nobody paid any heed to her protestations, and the dread morning came when Father was to take her to Summerside. Jingle was over and they ate breakfast together, sitting on the sandstone steps, with the sun rising readily over the hills of the mist and cherry trees along the dike throwing sprays of pearly blossoms against the blue sky. Pat was more resigned, having begun to thrill a little to the excitement about her. After all, it was nice to be quite important. Sid was blue, or envious, and Jingle was undoubtedly blue. Cuddles was crying because she had got it into her small golden head that something was going to happen to Pat, and Judy was warning her not to forget to write. Forget, was it likely? "And you must write me, Judy," said Pat anxiously. Oh, I don't be much of a hand at writing letters," said Judy dubiously, the truth being that Judy hadn't written any kind of a letter for over 20 years. "I'm thinking you'll have to depend on the rest of the folks for letters, but send me a scrape of the pen now and again for all that." Pat had but her 3 favorite dolls to bed in her dollhouse, and got Judy to put it away for her in the blue chest. She had bid tearful farewells to every room in the house, and every tree within calling distance, and to her own face in the water of the well. Snickle, Fritz, and McGinty and Thursday had been hugged and wept over. Then came the awful ordeal of saying goodbye to everybody. Judy's last glimpse of Pat was a rather tragic little face peering out the back window of the car. "Sure, and this is going to be the lonesome place till she comes back," sighed Judy. Part 2. Pat had no sooner arrived at Elmwood than she wrote Mother a pitiful letter entreating to be taken home. That first night at Elmwood was a rather dreadful one. The big, old-fashioned bed, with its tent canopy hung with yellowed net, was so huge she felt lost in it. And at home Mother or Judy would be standing at the kitchen door, calling everybody in out of the dark. "Oh!" Pat gave a smothered yelp of anguish at the thought. But This is just a visit. I'll soon be home again in just 21 days, she reminded herself bravely. Her next letter to Judy was more cheerful. Pat had discovered that there was some pleasant things about visiting. Uncle Brian's house was quite near, and Aunt Helen was surprisingly kind and nice in her own home. It was quite exciting to be taken downtown every day and see all the entrancing things in the store windows. Sometimes Norma and Amy took her down Saturday evenings when the windows were lighted up and looked like fairyland, especially the druggist's, where there were such beautiful colored bottles of blue and ruby and purple. Aunt Helen's house is very fine, wrote Pat, beginning also to discover that she liked writing letters. It is much more splendid than the Bayshore house, and Uncle Brian's is finer still, but I wouldn't let on to Norma that I thought it fine because she has always bragged so about it. She said to me, "Isn't it handsomer than Silverbush?" And I said, "Yes, much handsomer, but not half so lovely." I like Uncle Brian better now. He shook hands with me just as if I was grown up. Norma is as stuck-up as ever, but Amy is nice. Aunt Helen has a plaster Paris dog on the dining room mantel that looks just like Sam Binney. Aunt Helen says all Amasa Taylor's apple trees were gnawed to death by mice last winter. Oh, Judy, I hope our apple trees will never be gnawed by mice. Please tell Father not to name the new red calf till I come home. It won't be long now, only 14 more days. Don't forget to give Thursday his milk every night, Judy, and please put a little cream in it. Are the columbines and the bleeding heart out yet? I hope Cuddles won't grow too much before I get back. Aunt Helen gave me a new dress. She says it is a sensible dress. I don't like sensible dresses much, and there are no Sunday raisins here. Aunt Helen is a perfect housekeeper. The neighbors say you could eat your porridge off her floor, but she never puts enough salt in her porridge, so I don't like to eat it anywhere. Uncle Brian says Jim Hartley will come to a bad end. Jim lives next door, and it is exciting to look at him and wonder what the end will be. Do you think he may be hung, Judy? Aunt Helen lets me drink tea. She says it is all nonsense the way they bring up children nowadays not to drink tea. Old cousin George Gardner told me I didn't look much like my mother. He said Mother had been a beauty in her day. It made me feel he was disappointed in me. He praised Norma and Amy for their good looks. I don't mind how much he praises their looks, but I can't bear to hear their house praised. I think bay windows are horrid. Oh, Judy, I do hope everything will stay just the same at Silverbush till I get back. It was wildly exciting to get letters from home. Miss Patricia Gardner, Elmwood, Summerside. Jingle wrote the nicest letters because he told her things no one else thought of telling her. How the Silverbush folks were pestered with squirrels in the garret and Judy was clean wild. How the sheep laurel was out in happiness. What apple trees had the most bloom. How Joe had cut off Gentleman Tom's whiskers, but Judy said they would grow in all right again. How the barn cat had kittens, and, most wonderful of all, how the farm with the long, lonely house had been sold to some strange man who was coming there to live. Pat was thrilled over this, but it was terrible to think of these things happening, and she had not been there to see them. "Only 10 days more," said Pat, looking at the calendar. "Only 10 days more and I'll be home." Judy did not write, but she sent messages in everybody's letters. "Tell her the house do be that lonely for her," was one Pat liked best, and "that skinny beau of yours do be looking as if he was sent for and couldn't go," was the one she liked the least. Pat found Aunt Jessie's afternoon tea, which she was giving for a visiting friend, very tiresome. Norma and Amy were too much taken up with their own doings to bother with her. Her head ached with the crowd, and the lights, and the chatter. They sound just like Uncle Tom's geese when they all start chattering at once, thought Pat unkindly. She slipped away upstairs to seek a quiet spot where she could sit and dream of Silverbush, and found it in Uncle Brian's snuggery at the end of the hall. But when she pulled aside the curtain to creep into the window seat, It was already occupied. A little girl of about her own age was curled up in the corner, a girl who had been crying, but who now looked up at Pat with half appealing, half defiant eyes. Beautiful eyes, large, dreamy, gray eyes, the loveliest eyes Pat had ever seen, with long lashes quilling darkly around them. And there was something besides beauty in the eyes. Pat could not have told what it was, only it gave her a queer feeling that she had known this girl always. Perhaps the stranger felt something of the same when she looked into Pat's eyes, or perhaps it was Pat's smile. Already, little Pat Gardner's smile was, unknown to Pat, becoming a clan tradition. At all events, she suddenly shook back her thick brown curls, drew her feet under her, and pointed to the opposite corner of the seat with a welcoming smile on her small, flower-like face. They were good friends before they spoke a word to each other. Pat hopped in and squirmed down. The heavy blue velvet curtain swung behind her, cutting them off from the world. Outside, the boughs of a pine tree screened the window. They were alone together. They looked at each other and smiled again. "I'm Patricia Gardner of Silverbush," said Pat. "I'm Elizabeth Wilcox, but they call me Betts," said the girl. "Why, that's the name of the man who has bought the long, lonely house farm at North Glen," cried Pat. Betts nodded. "Yes, that's Dad, and that's why I've been crying. I don't want to go away down there, so far from everybody." "It's not far from me," said Pat eagerly. Betts seemed to find comfort in this. "Isn't it, really? Just a cat's walk, as Judy says, right up a hill from Silverbush. And it's a lovely old house. I'm so fond of it. I've always wanted to see a light in it. Oh, I'm glad you're coming to it, Betts." Betts blinked the last tears out of her eyes and thought she might be glad too. They sat there together and talked until there was a hue and cry through the house for them, and Betts was dragged away by the aunt who had brought her to the party. But by this time she and Pat knew all that was worthwhile knowing about each other's pasts. Part 3. "Oh, Judy," Pat wrote that night, "I found the dearest friend. Her name is Betts Wilcox, and she is coming to live at the long, lonely house. It will soon have a light in its windows now. Her full name is Elizabeth Gertrude, and she is so pretty, far prettier than Norma, and we've promised each other that we'll always be faithful till death do us part. Just think, Judy, this time yesterday I didn't know there was such a person in the world. Aunt Helen says she is very delicate, and this is why her father has sold his farm, which is kind of low and marshy, and he thinks the Longhouse farm will be healthier. I never thought I could like anyone outside my own family as much as I like Betts. It was Norma found us in the window seat, and I guess she was jealous because she sniffed and said, 'Birds of a feather, I suppose.' And when I said yes, she said to Betts, 'You mustn't cut her out with Hilary Gordon. She's his girl, you know.' I said, very dignified, Judy, 'I'm not his girl. We are just good friends.' I told Betts all about Jingle, and she said we ought to try to make his life happier, and she thinks it's awfully silly to talk about a boy being your beau when he is just a friend, and she says we can't think about beaus for at least 7 years yet. I said I was never going to think of them, but Betts said they might be nice to have when you grew up. But oh, Judy, I haven't told you the strangest thing. Betts and I were born on the same day. That makes us kind of twins, doesn't it? And we both love poetry passionately. Betts says that Mr. George Palmer, who lives on the farm next to them, found out his son was writing poetry and whipped him for it. Betts is going to lend me a fairy story called The Honey Stew of the Countess Bertha. She says there is a lovely ghost in it. Oh, Judy, day after tomorrow I'll be home. It seems too good to be true." Part 4. "The best part of a visit is getting home," said Pat. Uncle Brian drove her down to Silverbush one evening. To Uncle Brian, it meant a pleasant half-hour's run after a tiresome day in the office. To Pat, it meant a breathtaking return from exile. It was dark, and she could see only the lights of the North Glen farmsteads, but she knew them all. Mr. French's light, and the Floyd light, Jimmy Cart's light, and the light of Silverbridge away off to the right, the Robinsons' light. The Robinses had been away for months, but they must be home again. How nice to see their light in its old place. The dark roads were strange, but it was their own strangeness, a strangeness she knew. And then the home lane. Wasn't that Joe's whistle? And the friendly old trees waving their hands at her, and the house with all its windows alight to welcome her, Gentleman Tom sitting on the gate post, and all the family to run out and meet her, except Dad, who had to go to a political meeting at Silverbridge, and Cuddles, who was 2 years old and hadn't said a word yet, to the secret worry of everybody, suddenly crowed out, "Pat!" clearly and distinctly. Jingle and McGinty were there too, and supper in the kitchen with crisp golden brown rolls and fried brook trout Jingle had caught in Jordan for her. Judy wore a new drugget dress and the broadest of smiles. Nothing was changed. Pat had been secretly afraid they might have moved some of the furniture about, that the kittens in the picture might have grown up, or King William and his white horse got across the Boyne. It was beautiful to see the moon rising over her own fields. She loved to hear the North Glen dogs barking from farm to farm. "Did Joe really cut off Gentleman Tom's whiskers, Judy?" "Sure, he did that same, the spalpeen, and a funnier-looking baste you never saw. But they're growing in again fine." "I'll have to get acquainted with everything all over again," said Pat joyfully. "Won't Dad be home before I go to bed, Judy?" "It's not likely," said Judy, who had her own reasons for wanting Pat to get a good night's rest before she saw Long Alec. Her own dear room, such a quiet, pleasant, happy little room, and her own dear bed waiting for her. Then the fun of getting up in the morning and seeing everything by daylight. The garden had grown beyond belief, but it knew her. Oh, it knew her. She flew about and kissed all the trees, even the cross little spruce tree at the gate she had never really liked. It was so grumpy. She flung a kiss to it. Pat in the well. Life was too sweet. And then she saw Father coming from the barn. They got her comforted after a while, though for a time Judy thought she had them beat. Long Alec had to promise he would let his moustache grow again immediately before she would stop crying. "Sure, and I told you what a shock it would be to her," Judy said reproachfully to Long Alec. "You know how hard she takes any change, and you should have waited until she had her fun out of coming home before you shaved it off." It was a subdued Pat, who went along the whispering lane to see the folks at Swallowfield, and be rejoiced over by an uncle and aunts who had missed her sadly. But still, it was lovely to be back home, and thank goodness Uncle Tom hadn't shaved his whiskers off.